Backgrounds. Everyone's worst nightmare. Or perhaps it's my worst nightmare, I don't know anymore. Backgrounds have historically been a weakness of mine. Drawing people wasn't as much of a problem, and you would think that I'd have an easy time drawing backgrounds too, because just about everything requires shapes to draw. But backgrounds? Ha! Ha ha ha. There's several underlying reasons as to why I believe this to be the case, but I think the biggest one was that I spent so long staying in my comfort zone and sticking to drawing people while relegating the backgrounds to the side as an afterthought. And let's be real here, my art suffered big time for it, and in a way it still is. I actually took a whole class on drawing backgrounds when I was in college, and I distinctly remember throwing my whole back into trying to make my assignments look good. We had to draw backgrounds from 5 different time periods, using a metric ton of historical reference to make our pieces look more convincing. But honestly, those were probably my background magnum opuses. And I want to change that because imagine peaking in a certain field of expertise at the age of 21. So what is an artist with weak background drawing skills to do? Fix it. As a way to step out of my comfort zone and in an attempt to improve at something I have been historically bad at, I spent a week-ish drawing backgrounds. I drew 3 different backgrounds, each fulfilling 1 or more goals that I set for myself in regards to the art of drawing backgrounds specifically. From drawing cityscapes to lighting to drawing more complex structures to, in one case, making sure the perspectives lined up. I want to tackle perspective more since I'm arguably worse at that than I am at backgrounds, but I'm saving that for another video. Some of these backgrounds were referenced from a single photograph, while others were inspired by a combination of photos. As I said earlier, I'm not background Da Vinci by any means, so I can't guarantee that these backgrounds are going to be immaculate, but I am going to do my best. And try not to melt into a sentient puddle or something. Anyway, if you're new here and you want to see me endure the trials of forcing myself to draw things that I'm terrible at, then make sure to like and subscribe. And if you're already subscribed, then welcome back to the spaghetti layer. Either way, strap your butts in because here we go! Let's start with the first background that I want to talk about. And no, this definitely wasn't the last background that I finished. What are you talking about? Haha! While brainstorming what I wanted to tackle for this video, I knew that I had to sneak in at least one landscape. Prior to this, I would just draw bumps resembling mountains and call it a day. That's not inherently bad, but I wanted to push myself further, so I grabbed a bunch of reference images before I began drawing, including images of the Swiss Alps and the Dolomites. That's what it said on Pinterest anyway. Admittedly, I had a bit of trouble with the sketch at first. I actually forgot to turn on the time-lapse while I was struggling with the sketch. Sorry. But initially I wasn't sure whether to start with the mountain formations or whether I should block in where everything would go with a bunch of rectangles. After some trial and error though, I started the sketch over. I begin with the rock formation at the very front, followed by the mountains in the back, paying attention to the shapes of the peaks. While this little plateau thingy was borrowed from one of the reference images, I wanted to switch things up for the drawing, so I added a waterfall. Once the sketch was complete, I cleaned up the lines and changed them from pink to a darker color because I wanted to try something different and use the sketch as the line art. I definitely had to do some more cleanup with the line work as I went, but I think it turned out pretty good. And also, fun fact, this is the only drawing where I didn't use Clip Studio Paint's perspective ruler for the line art. I wanted a more muted palette for this drawing, so I went with a grayish blue for the mountains, a muted green for the grass, and a color similar to the sky for the water. Come to think of it, I might have straight up used the same color as the sky. I added some darker tones for the shadows and then started to add the highlights, going in with varying opacities and constantly studying the reference images for how the light would hit the peaks and everything else. I also had to remind myself to be more cognizant of where the light source would come from since I sometimes space out when doing the lighting. Although I did incorporate some rim lighting to break things up. There was some experimentation when I was rendering everything. I did about half of it on one layer and the other half on several add glow layers, my typical go-to blending mode for highlights. I also played around with the blend tool for the edges to give it more of a realistic feel, but I didn't like how some of the blended edges looked, so I settled for the usual cleaner edges instead, while also blurring out some of the edges of the highlights. The grass also required a bit of trial and error. I started out with a lasso fill tool for the highlights before using the Gaussian blur option and trying to erase the edges with the leaf brush. At first I didn't like this either, but this time I chose to trust the process and color in all of the spaces between the highlights with varying shades of green that complemented the color palette. The leaf brush can be a bit finicky when it comes to color placement, so I had to redo some of the brush strokes several times. And to bump up the contrast, I adjusted the luminosity and the saturation of the grass once I was done rendering it. I added some sunlight on a new layer and then added some stronger highlights to the rocks, while also using the airbrush tool on the peaks towards the back. And this brings me to a useful tip I learned in college. If you're drawing a background and there are mountains or other structures that are farther away from the viewer, they won't be as vibrant or distinct as what you see at the front. One way to illustrate this is to use the airbrush tool on a layer above your line art, set it to a low opacity, and go over the parts of the background that are farther away until you have the desired effect, which is what I did for this drawing. This won't just give a more realistic touch to your pieces, it'll also give you the magical and marvelous illusion of depth. The more you know. But let's now go back to the drawing process. You'll see that I originally had 2 floating rock formations in the drawing, but as I continued the rendering process, I realized that I wasn't entirely happy with how they affected the composition. So I removed them before I began rendering the waterfall. The waterfall and the stream leading to it were a bit of a struggle. I had to pay attention to which parts would be lighter and which parts would be darker. But as I studied the reference, I noticed that the water turned white in places where it went past the rocks and also where it went over the edges of the rocks. Wait, do these count as white caps? Anyway. I used a noise brush for the water spray towards the bottom of the waterfall where it disappears behind the rock formations in the front of the piece, and after some finishing touches with the mountains, I painted in the clouds. As with the waterfall, the clouds required some more trial and error. I think a lot of it had to do with figuring out how I was going to soften the edges of the shadows of the clouds, and how I was going to render those shadows while still having them be cloud-like. I was eventually able to figure it out, though. For the final touches, I went in with a shade of purple on a soft light layer to heighten the atmosphere, and used a multiply layer to add additional shadows to the mountains. Then, after adding some more lighting and doing additional cleanup with the line art, the artwork was finished. According to the actual length of the time-lapse for this piece, about 2.5 minutes, but slowed down to accommodate my commentary, this piece actually took the shortest amount of time for me to complete. I went into this piece wanting to better understand how to render mountains and other things of that nature, and I definitely learned a few things as I was drawing this piece. So I would say mission accomplished. But before I start rambling, let's move on to the next background. This next background is actually one that I may use for future reference in my webcomic. That still needs to get updated soon, but that's besides the point. Because this background drawing is a part of the city where the story takes place. I will confess that this piece was the first one I started for this video, but the second one that I finished. And I would say that this drawing was slightly more in my comfort zone because I needed to get my feet wet somehow. At least, that was the idea. The initial goal going into this piece was to draw more complex buildings, as you'll see later with a taller building in the back, and to draw buildings that are more than just simple houses. Once again, the reference came in clutch for that, especially when it came time to flesh out the arches and the triangular bits that I mapped out during the sketch. However, as I was sketching and doing the line art, I chose to give myself an additional challenge, sticking to grayscale and utilizing the screen tones that Clip Studio Paint has to offer. This forced me to think differently about how I would render the textures of the wood and the brick walls, which I did as I was doing the line art, and I'm actually pretty happy with the results. After collecting some reference images as I did for the last drawing, I got to work. Initially, I had a hard time figuring out where the vanishing point would go, but I ultimately stuck with my original idea. Then I sketched the buildings with the help of the perspective ruler, which proved to be very useful with both this piece and the one that I'm going to talk about next. And I ended up using it for most of the sketch and almost all of the line art. As I mentioned earlier, I planned on drawing several arches, like the ones on the structure in the center, and as I was sketching, I used a series of straight lines to map out where the arches would go so I could make them as even as possible when the time came to do the line art. Speaking of making things even, I constantly made sure the windows and the little window shutter things you can see in the front lined up with the ones on the sides. And the same went for the windows on the left and the windows on the right. To ensure this, I drew some lines on the sketch layer to map out where the shutters on the sides of the pillar-like structures would go. Kinda tedious, but definitely worth it. I also had to make sure the windows with the glass panes lined up with each other too, even though I noticed later on that I was lacking in some of those areas. Let's pretend that it's a structural thing, no one will notice, right? As I was doing the line art, I did some copying and pasting with certain parts of the line work to save time. Reference is your bestie, but so are shortcuts. Use them when you can, folks! I was about 3/4 of the way done with the line art when I noticed that I forgot to draw one of the doors, so I went in and did that before I began adding texture to the wooden panels, the roofs, and the walls. I did some hatching in the corners of the walls and also drew some lines to indicate where the bricks were, leaving some pockets of blank space to let everything breathe, so to speak. And also for the aesthetic. I also did some additional hatching in places that I knew wouldn't be exposed to the sunlight, like the undersides of the metal covers on the chimneys and the tower in the back to the left. While this was another more laborious part of the drawing process, it was also fun and oddly relaxing to do in a way. Probably because it's fun to see what a wall would look like with a brick texture slapped onto it. Even though I was going to go in with screen tones later on, I wanted to fill out some small sections in black to break things up just a bit more. Most of those sections were part of the tower to the right of the piece, and I used the bucket tool to fill those sections in. There were some breaks in the line art though, so I had to close those before using the bucket tool. Otherwise, the black would just bleed into the surrounding sections that I didn't want to fill in, and that would be a bit of a mess to clean up. Then came time for the last part, and one of my other favorite parts of the process for this piece. Clip Studio Paint has a wide array of screen tones for you to use, but despite the fact that I've been using CSP for almost 6 years, I don't recall ever using these screen tones for this sort of thing. Apart from a couple of hiccups which involved having to mix and match screen tones to see if they wouldn't mess up all of the other ones I had on the canvas, though, I got the hang of them pretty quickly. However, I didn't use the screen tones for every section I wanted to shade. For the road and for the shadows, I used some simple black and gray gradients. As for everything else, I used dotted screen tones for things like the sky and the glass windows, erasing some parts with the eraser and the lasso fill tool after converting the screen tones to raster layers to set up the window highlights in the clouds. For the wooden sections, I used a line screen tone because I felt like it better simulated the texture of the wood than the dotted screen tones I used with the other sections. Finally, once I was satisfied with everything, all I had to do was put my signature on the canvas and the second piece was done. I'm glad I took a chance with the screen tones and the monochrome coloring that I did with this piece. While I'm mostly satisfied with how everything came out, I feel like I could have made the rooftops more distinct from the sky since I feel like they have similar values. But that aside, let's now move on to the last and most complex piece of the bunch. So now we're finishing things off with a good old trial by fire. I say that because even though I saved the most complex background for last, this was actually the first background I completed of the 3 that I drew. Or maybe I should say backgrounds, because this single page spread is actually for a 2-page comic that I drew. So since we're here, I may as well talk about all of the backgrounds that went into this comic. Hear me out. This still counts. Don't bully me, please. I know you're watching this, Kyle, from school. Now, some of you may recognize the background on the second page spread. That's because it's literally Sorrento, which is a town located on the Sorrentine Peninsula in southern Italy. Sorrentine Peninsula? Help. Regardless of how you pronounce it, the giant lemons there have still not left my mind, it seems. To be honest though, with the way this spread turned out, I'm not sure if I would call this Sorrento so much as I would call this its evil twin sister. Even though I wanted to recreate the reference image as accurately as possible, and I was able to capture almost all of the buildings in my drawing, there were still some things that I missed. Safe to say, I absolutely butchered somebody's home in the process. Mi dispiace. But to be fair to myself, the location is largely recognizable in the drawing, and the reference image, or screenshot that I took, was of a pretty distinct part of the town. But anyway, let's talk about my process going into the backgrounds for this comic, as well as the comic itself. I mean, I'm here, so I may as well talk about it. Probably. Do you ever get those silly ideas for short stories in your head? Do those silly ideas tend to be a little unhinged? Do they make you think things like, man, I wonder what would happen if my characters got sent to Earth? It's real. It's possible. It happened to me. Prior to drawing this comic, I had entertained the idea of my webcomic's main characters using their allotted vacation days to go to Earth. Probably via some sort of interdimensional portal that they rented through a travel agent. Going into the comic, I had already planned to have the giant spread of Sorrento be at the end as a means of revealing where exactly my characters were, but I feel like I was shooting myself in the foot here because complex backgrounds like these, particularly with many buildings clustered together, are way out of my wheelhouse. And not only that, I have another panel in my webcomic's first chapter with an overhead view of the city where the story takes place. While this spread for the short comic was very useful to get myself prepared for that, this means that I am gonna have to put myself through the rigor again. But now let's actually move on to the drawing process. I'm starting with the comic's first page since, even though some of the challenges that I faced on the first page persisted on page 2, it was comparatively easier to bang out. And also it'd be a bit weird if I talked about the second page first. The first panel is the establishing shot, and because of that I wanted to show as much of the background and give the viewer as clear of an indication as to where the characters are as possible. I've actually been on the street featured in the first panel, which made it even more fun for me to draw, but I guess you could say it also added a level of difficulty to the challenge, since I already wanted to recreate everything as faithfully and have it be as recognizable as possible. That, and I had to make sure everything lined up perspective-wise, especially the chairs and the awning things above the seating areas. Normally I draw the characters before I draw the backgrounds, but this time I wanted to do something different and draw the backgrounds first. I drew the perspective lines and the vanishing point before sketching out the shapes of the seating areas, the buildings, and other structures. Then I fleshed out most of the structures by freehand before adding the characters in. I would say this turned out pretty good and better than I expected, even if I had to make a few adjustments before doing the line art. As for the other panels, it was characters before background since I wouldn't need to do as much problem solving if that makes any sense. I made sure I had at least one piece of reference on hand while drawing everything. For the backgrounds, I studied the fabric folds of the tablecloths and the awning things, the shape of the benches to the right, the chairs, and I also looked up reference for coats draped over chairs since two of the characters, that being Lark and Peter, have their own coats draped over their chairs. But once I was satisfied with the sketches and the placement of where everything was, it was time for the line art. I won't go into it too much since the line art was business as usual, but I do want to point out that I took a bit of a risk and freehanded some of the lines for the buildings and the structures and also the chairs. And I'm very happy with how everything turned out. I also stuck to my usual process for the coloring and the shading. I stuck to cooler tones to reflect the atmosphere that I wanted, and made the flat colors darker in places that would be cast in shadow, such as under the awnings. I used some texture brushes on the bricks to the characters left, and I used one of the default assets in Clip Studio Paint to mimic the stone tiles on the street. After that I used Multiply for the shading and an Add Glow layer for the highlights and the ambient lighting, and the first page was done. Which left the behemoth. I do say that a little loosely since I was switching between working on the two pages to give my brain a break and also so I wouldn't have an existential crisis looking at all of the buildings I had to draw for the second page. The setup for the second page was easy enough. Once again, I sketched the vanishing point and the perspective lines before doing the mountains and the coastline, paying attention to the pier, the structures along the coastline, and the rock formations. Once that was done, I began sketching the buildings, but along the way I tried a bit of an experiment. I spent about an hour trying to freehand the line art for the buildings, aided by the perspective ruler, thinking this would save me some time, but it just ended up taking more time than I had anticipated and would have required a lot of guesswork. So I gave up on that and went back to sketching the buildings. And I'm glad I did, because that was a part of the process that I made pretty quick work of in comparison to my little experiment. And also the line art itself. Oh boy, the line art. I was actually on a time crunch for this comic, and as a result, I really wanted to finish this page in a day, not taking the other page into account. But despite knowing that the spread would take some time, I was not prepared for how long the line art would actually take. Maybe I was still feeling accomplished with how fast the sketches took, and I was starting to get delusional. The world may never know. It wasn't just the laborious process of drawing the line art for each building, it was making sure the buildings themselves lined up with a perspective. I found myself relying a little too much on the reference image multiple times, and as a result, the perspective ended up being slightly off from what I wanted for the drawing. So I had to fix those. I also had to go back and fix some of the structures as I was doing the line art since I had forgotten about them during the sketching process. And then I had to freehand the arches on some of the buildings as well as the rooftops and each individual window for the many buildings that I had to draw. I'm glad there were trees interspersed between some of the buildings, which meant the work was marginally easier, but nothing fully prepares you for how challenging these sorts of backgrounds can be. 11 hours later, or thereabouts, I was finally done with the line art. It was late at night by that time, but I still felt the urge to power through, so I spent another 3 hours getting through most of the flat colors. The coloring process was the same as the first page, so not a lot to say there. The coloring didn't take quite as long as the line art, but I will say that it got kind of tedious when the time came to color in the buildings and the pier and the little structures along the pier. I think they're supposed to be changing rooms because there are beaches along the coastline, but because they're so small from the viewer's perspective, I had to economize their appearance, even though I really didn't want to. While I was doing the coloring, I also realized that I had missed some of the structures at the edge of the pier, so I had to go back in and draw those before I continued with the coloring. As I was coloring, I also paid attention to the colors of the buildings in the reference image and made sure those colors matched up with the corresponding building in the drawing. At least, all of the ones that are readily noticeable. Looking back at it, the pier does look a bit lacking in comparison to the rest of the image, so I might go back in to change that before I post this comic to the rest of the internets. The shading was also similar to page 1, but I used softer edges for the shading on the rocks and the mountains and a water texture for the waves to save time. I drew in the highlights for the waves, however. As another means to save time, I used the bucket tool for certain parts of the shading, specifically for the buildings and some of the other structures. Then after adding the ambient lighting and some sun rays, the second page was finally done. Even though I knew I was setting myself up for a challenge, this background in particular felt like a challenge and a half. This is probably one of the most complex backgrounds I've ever drawn, but I'm happy that I did this because not only do I have a better understanding of how this kind of background works, it's also good preparation for the kinds of complex backgrounds that I want to draw for my other comics later down the line. As I said earlier, I feel like it could be better, but that's what practice is for, so hopefully not a complete loss. But let's now look at all of these drawings one more time. These were all of the backgrounds I drew as a form of going through the gauntlet, I mean getting out of my comfort zone. As I've said, this was way out of my wheelhouse, and to be honest, I wish I had the same dedication as the people who enjoy drawing this sort of stuff. But I'm glad I did it because backgrounds are one of the many things I want to work on. I actually want to draw more backgrounds in the future, and maybe do that as a follow-up to this video. If I do a follow-up, I definitely want to draw at least one interior because I didn't get to do that here. But to be honest, with how much time these backgrounds took me, that's probably going to take a hot minute. But nevertheless, that is going to do it for this video. If you like this video and you want to see more from me, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and tune in every other Friday for art-related videos and other quality shenanigans. If you want to support me further, please check out my other social media accounts as well as my Ko-fi and my Etsy shop, which are all in the description. And lastly, if you made it this far, leave a car emoji in the comment section below. And remember to keep things civil in the comments, or I will put a whoopee cushion in your chair when you least expect it. And yeah, that's about everything. Thanks for watching. Oh, by the way, keep your eyes peeled for YouTube memberships because that's going to launch in the next few days. If you want some fun bonus emojis and other cool stuff, then don't hesitate to join when memberships launch. Okay, now that's everything. Bye!